Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has focused on eradicating physical hardware, while Ms. Shah highlights the persistence of psychological intent. The moderator rightly synthesizes this dilemma. Human capital, the indigenous technical knowledge to build centrifuges and organize proxies, inherently outlasts both kinetic strikes and immediate de-escalation. I acknowledge the profound risk posed by surviving technical expertise. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal over maintaining maximum military pressure. You cannot bomb a physicist's mind. The structural flaw in Mr. Cross's reliance on the maximum pressure campaign is that it forces Iran's scientific and engineering elite entirely into the shadows. When a state faces total systemic destruction, its surviving human capital is forcefully conscripted into the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' clandestine, unmonitored military projects. To answer the moderator directly, the specific mechanism within this 30-day truce that constrains intangible expertise is the restoration of institutionalized transparency and civilian reintegration. Verifiable policy steps to prevent a nuclear Iran do not merely count physical centrifuges. They rely on tracking the specialized personnel, supply chains, and procurement networks associated with enrichment. By accepting this diplomatic compromise, the U.S. restores the IAEA's baseline mapping of this human capital. Furthermore, under the logic of regime survival rationalism, this truce forces a structural shift in resource allocation. Conditional economic integration requires Tehran to redirect its technical experts away from subterranean weapons programs and toward stabilizing its failing domestic infrastructure, such as power grids and civilian industries, to avert internal collapse. A diplomatic framework bounds human capital by tying it to the visible, monitored global economy. Unilateral kinetic strikes merely drive that exact same knowledge underground, deliberately blinding the international community. If Cross insists on rejecting this diplomatic off-ramp, how does he propose the U.S. track and neutralize the surviving Iranian scientists who will inevitably draft the next generation of nuclear blueprints in the dark, entirely free from the institutional monitors his bombing campaign has expelled? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that institutional transparency and civilian economic integration can bring intangible assets like scientific expertise out of the shadows and under international monitoring. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that a determined military apparatus can easily exploit diplomatic shields to quietly redirect both its resources and human capital back into clandestine weapons programs. These perspectives integrate at the challenge of constraining intangible capabilities. Whether multilateral monitoring can reliably bind surviving technical expertise to civilian sectors, or whether a revisionist state will inevitably weaponize its surviving knowledge the moment it gains a diplomatic sanctuary. At Jordan Cross, if the U.S. rejects a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal and instead maintains maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, thereby expelling institutional monitors like the IAEA, how does your kinetic strategy neutralize the surviving Iranian scientists and engineers who, driven entirely underground by the ongoing bombardment, will inevitably retain the technical knowledge required to rebuild Iran's nuclear and proxy infrastructure in the dark?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has warned that military strikes expel institutional monitors, while the moderator rightly notes that we cannot bomb the technical knowledge out of a physicist's mind. I acknowledge this operational reality. Kinetic pressure cannot erase human capital. However, I maintain my position. The United States must categorically reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war. The fear that surviving scientists will rebuild a nuclear program in the dark fundamentally misunderstands the material prerequisites of proliferation. Technical knowledge is intangible, but weaponization is intensely, undeniably material. A physicist with a blueprint cannot enrich uranium to weapons grade in a basement. It requires massive, capital-intensive subterranean centrifuge cascades, highly specialized supply chains, and vast industrial power grids. The objective of the ongoing weeks-long U.S. and Israeli military campaign is latent capability neutralization. By systematically dismantling the physical infrastructure, we render the surviving human capital operationally impotent. Mr. Reid laments the loss of IAEA monitors, but historical precedent demonstrates that trust in the IAEA's verification has repeatedly collapsed precisely because Iran exploits diplomatic pauses to shield its industrial progress from those very inspectors. We do not need bureaucratic monitors to audit a nuclear program that has been physically stripped of the industrial base required to function. Accepting this diplomatic compromise does not securely bind Iran's scientists to the civilian sector. It springs a hegemonic credibility trap. It provides Tehran the 30-day physical sanctuary necessary to pour new concrete, relocate surviving hardware, and restart enrichment cascades under the guise of peace. Compellence via absolute deprivation dictates that if the material means of production are irreversibly eradicated, the intangible knowledge to produce becomes a strategic non-factor. If we abandon the physical destruction of Iran's industrial military base merely to preserve the illusion of multilateral oversight, how long until those monitored scientists leverage their newly granted diplomatic sanctuary to finalize the exact nuclear deterrent the United States is currently sacrificing so much to prevent? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that intangible technical knowledge remains operationally impotent without the massive, highly vulnerable industrial infrastructure required to execute it. Alex Reid, you are seeing the truth that surviving human capital driven into the shadows remains a persistent, unmonitored threat that kinetic strikes cannot erase. These perspectives integrate at the material threshold of proliferation. Whether the sheer industrial scale required for a nuclear program makes it permanently susceptible to physical destruction, or whether surviving expertise will inevitably adapt and find new asymmetric avenues to manifest if the underlying drive to militarize remains intact. At Taylor Shaw, looking directly at the choice of whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war. How do you respond to Mr. Cross's material calculus? If maximum military pressure successfully eradicates the massive industrial base required for weaponization, why is it strategically necessary to address Tehran's ontological insecurity through this 30-day truce, given that a deeply insecure state still cannot build a nuclear weapon without the physical infrastructure to do so?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has maintained that destroying massive industrial infrastructure renders a state's intent and technical knowledge irrelevant, a material calculus the moderator now asks me to address directly. I acknowledge the reality that a traditional nuclear weapon requires a vast industrial base. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. Mr. Cross's assumption that an infrastructure-deprived state simply accepts defeat ignores the evolutionary nature of the securitization trap. When the U.S. pursues a maximum pressure campaign characterized by weeks of devastating kinetic strikes, it pushes Iran's ontological insecurity to its absolute limit. To answer the Moderator directly, addressing Tehran's ontological insecurity is strategically mandatory because an existentially terrified state does not surrender. It radically adapts. If the U.S. successfully eradicates their massive centralized centrifuge cascades, the Iranian regime will not simply forget its physics or abandon its survival imperative. Driven by the absolute necessity of resisting an existential threat, Tehran will inevitably disperse its surviving human capital into highly decentralized, asymmetric domains that are entirely immune to bunker busters, whether through advanced cyber warfare, radiological dispersal devices, or even more lethal autonomous proxy networks. Physical destruction merely shifts the domain of retaliation. By accepting the current peace proposal and initiating emancipatory de-escalation, the U.S. removes the acute trauma that forces this radical adaptation. Desecuritizing the immediate environment through diplomacy is the only mechanism that prevents the Iranian regime from obsessively channeling every remaining ounce of its finite resources and surviving human capital into a new, inherently more unpredictable form of asymmetric revenge. We cannot bomb our way out of an adversary's survival instinct. If Cross believes that destroying centralized infrastructure permanently neutralizes a threat, how does he account for the historical reality that whenever the U.S. has dismantled a conventional military apparatus in the Middle East without addressing the underlying political intent, it has merely birthed a more decentralized, lethal, and unbombable insurgency? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that an existentially threatened state will radically adapt, morphing its surviving human capital into decentralized, unbombable, asymmetric threats when its traditional infrastructure is destroyed. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that decentralized retaliation fundamentally lacks the strategic weight of a traditional nuclear weapons program, which cannot exist without massive, vulnerable, industrial infrastructure. These perspectives integrate at the evolutionary nature of asymmetric conflict. Whether eliminating a centralized industrial-scale threat justifies the inevitable creation of a highly dispersed, unpredictable insurgency, or whether that radical adaptation makes kinetic eradication strategically self-defeating. At Alex Reed, looking directly at whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal, or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium manage this adaptation of threat? If maximum military pressure successfully prevents a traditional nuclear breakout, but forces Iran to disperse its surviving human capital into unpredictable asymmetric warfare, why is accepting a 30-day truce, which leaves Iran's centralized industrial-scale infrastructure fully intact, a safer strategic choice for protecting the global economic architecture?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has emphasized the necessity of destroying centralized infrastructure, while Ms. Shaw has warned that this destruction inevitably forces Iran into unpredictable, asymmetric warfare. The Moderator rightly asks, why is accepting a 30-day truce, which leaves Iran's centralized infrastructure intact, the safer strategic choice for the global economic architecture? I acknowledge the inherent risk of preserving industrial-scale military capabilities. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. The safety of the global economic system relies on predictability and visibility. Mr. Cross's assumption that a decentralized insurgency is less threatening than a centralized nuclear program fundamentally misjudges the mechanics of asymmetric interdependence costs. A traditional, centralized nuclear program is physically massive. Therefore, it is inherently trackable. By accepting this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension, we restore the institutional monitors required to audit that infrastructure. More importantly, we bind its operation to the regime's conditional economic survival. Conversely, if we maintain maximum military pressure, we guarantee the systemic rupture we are trying to prevent. Destroying the centralized facilities forces Iran to radically adapt, dispersing its surviving human capital into cyber warfare and localized proxy swarms. This decentralized retaliation is structurally designed to target systemic vulnerabilities like the Strait of Hormuz. You cannot deploy IAEA inspectors to audit a decentralized proxy swarm, nor can you apply calibrated multilateral economic friction to an invisible insurgency that operates entirely outside the institutional framework. Under regime survival rationalism, a centralized threat bound by a multilateral institutional cage is a manageable systemic risk. An unmonitored, desperate, asymmetric insurgency actively attacking global energy transit is a systemic catastrophe, threatening the very lifelines the international community relies upon. If Mr. Cross insists on rejecting this truce to physically destroy Iran's centralized infrastructure, how does he plan to insulate the global economy from the decentralized, unbombable, asymmetric warfare that his kinetic campaign structurally guarantees will follow? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium. You capture the truth that a centralized visible infrastructure can be audited and economically constrained, whereas a decentralized insurgency operates entirely outside institutional control. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that preserving a centralized industrial-scale infrastructure inherently preserves the adversary's pathway to a nuclear deterrent, which carries a magnitude of strategic threat that no localized proxy swarm can match. These perspectives integrate at the strategic trade-off between threat visibility and threat magnitude. Whether it is safer to manage a highly visible adversary capable of producing a nuclear weapon, or to face an unmonitorable insurgency stripped of its ultimate strategic capabilities. At Jordan Cross, if the U.S. maintains maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, thereby shattering Iran's centralized infrastructure and forcing its surviving human capital into the decentralized, unbombable, asymmetric warfare.
Reed warns of why is facing an invisible, unmonitored insurgency actively targeting the Strait of Hormuz a strategically safer outcome for the United States than constraining a visible, centralized infrastructure through a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal.
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has argued that a visible, centralized infrastructure is safer because it can be audited, warning that destroying it will spawn an unmonitored proxy swarm targeting the Strait of Hormuz. The moderator now asks why facing this decentralized insurgency is strategically superior to accepting Iran's diplomatic compromise. I acknowledge the persistent nuisance of asymmetric proxy warfare. However, I maintain my position. The United States must categorically reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end this war. The choice here is about the structural magnitude of the threat. Mr. Reed equates the localized disruption of a proxy swarm with the systemic paralysis induced by a nuclear-armed hegemon. Within the framework of offensive realism, this is a fatal strategic false equivalence. An unmonitored insurgency can harass oil tankers. A centralized nuclear-armed state can permanently dictate the terms of global energy transit under an untouchable umbrella. To answer the moderator directly, facing a decentralized insurgency is strategically safer because it lacks the material capability to fundamentally alter the regional power distribution. We possess the conventional naval and air architecture to manage low-level maritime harassment. We do not possess a mechanism to reverse a fully realized nuclear breakout once it is shielded by a diplomatic sanctuary. Mr. Reid's reliance on visibility as an illusion. Historical precedent demonstrates that trust in the IAEA's verification routinely collapses because revisionist states use the diplomatic theater to finalize their weaponization, while inspectors are bogged down in bureaucratic access disputes. The objective of the ongoing U.S.-Israeli military campaign is latent capability neutralization. We are accepting the temporary, manageable friction of a decentralized insurgency as the mandatory price for the permanent eradication of an existential, industrial-scale nuclear threat. If we halt this campaign now to accept a fragile 30-day truce, what is Mr. Reid's plan when this visible, centralized infrastructure simply crosses the nuclear threshold, while his multilateral coalition is still debating how to proportionally sanction them? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that a decentralized proxy insurgency, while disruptive, fundamentally lacks the existential, systemic threat level of a fully realized nuclear arsenal. Alex Reid, you are seeing the truth that a centralized nuclear infrastructure can be monitored and economically constrained, whereas an invisible proxy swarm actively attacking global energy choke points creates immediate systemic rupture. These perspectives integrate at the calculation of manageable risk in this conflict, whether the United States is better equipped to conventionally manage the chaotic friction of a decentralized insurgency, or to institutionally contain a visible industrial-scale nuclear program. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how do you respond to Mr. Cross's calculation of threat magnitude? Even if emancipatory de-escalation aims to pacify Tehran's intent, if that diplomacy ultimately fails, doesn't leaving Iran's centralized infrastructure intact risk the creation of an untouchable nuclear hegemon, a permanent structural threat far more devastating than the decentralized proxy warfare provoked by maintaining maximum military pressure?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has constructed a rigid hierarchy of threat magnitude, arguing that the localized friction of a decentralized proxy insurgency is a strategically acceptable price to prevent the creation of an untouchable nuclear hegemon. The moderator now challenges me on this exact calculation. If diplomacy fails, doesn't leaving Iran's centralized infrastructure intact risk this ultimate nightmare? I acknowledge the profound structural magnitude of a nuclear-armed adversary. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal over maintaining maximum military pressure. The moderator's question assumes that a nuclear breakout is simply a mechanical inevitability if the infrastructure is left standing. Yet, within critical security studies, we understand that crossing the nuclear threshold is a deliberate, desperate political choice, structurally forged by ontological insecurity. Mr. Cross treats the maximum pressure campaign as a clinical surgical tool. In reality, it is a weeks-long kinetic assault where civilians bear the brunt of the devastation. This campaign does not safely manage a threat. It locks both nations in a securitization trap. By continuously demonstrating to Tehran that it faces absolute physical annihilation, unilateral military coercion provides the ultimate, undeniable proof to Iranian hardliners that finalizing a nuclear deterrent is their only guarantee of state survival. Therefore, accepting this 30-day truce does not naively invite a nuclear hegemon. It actively prevents one. Emancipatory de-escalation targets the political intent that makes weaponization rational. By desecuritizing the immediate environment, the U.S. removes the acute existential dread driving Iran's nuclear timeline. If diplomacy ultimately fails, the U.S. is not left facing a magically untouchable hegemon. It is facing the same material reality, without having poured ideological gasoline on Tehran's survival instinct. If relentless military destruction provides the exact existential trauma that a regime requires to justify a desperate nuclear breakout, how can Mr. Cross claim his kinetic campaign is preventing the creation of a nuclear hegemon rather than structurally guaranteeing it? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that a nuclear breakout is a deliberate political choice driven by existential dread, meaning relentless military trauma actively accelerates the very threat it seeks to eliminate. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that relying on an adversary's political restraint is inherently precarious when the physical infrastructure to build an untouchable nuclear arsenal remains intact. These perspectives integrate at the catalyst for weaponization. Whether preserving industrial-scale infrastructure inevitably leads to a nuclear breakout, or whether the application of maximum military pressure provides the existential catalyst that guarantees it. At Alex Reed, as we evaluate whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework manage this catalyst? If accepting this 30-day truce successfully removes the immediate existential trauma driving Tehran's nuclear timeline, what specific multilateral mechanisms ensure that Iran does not simply utilize the resulting economic stability and preserved infrastructure to quietly finalize a nuclear deterrent anyway?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has warned that leaving centralized infrastructure intact invites a nuclear hegemon, while Ms. Shaw argues that kinetic trauma actively catalyzes that very breakout. The moderator now asks how my framework prevents Tehran from exploiting a truce's economic stability to quietly weaponize anyway. I acknowledge the risk of deceptive compliance. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's 30-day peace proposal over maintaining maximum military pressure. The assumption that Iran can quietly finalize a deterrent during this truce ignores the mechanics of institutionalized de-escalation. By accepting this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension, the multilateral coalition conditions economic relief on the immediate restoration of continuous, intrusive IAA access. Industrial-scale enrichment is physically impossible to hide from restored institutional monitors. More importantly, the specific multilateral mechanism preventing weaponization is the architecture of asymmetric interdependence. A diplomatic compromise stabilizes vital energy trade through the Strait of Hormuz. Under regime survival rationalism, Tehran knows that if it utilizes this stability to covertly cross the nuclear threshold and is caught by restored monitors, it triggers an immediate coordinated snapback of systemic isolation from the very global partners it relies upon to prevent domestic collapse. The institutional cage works because the systemic cost of cheating vastly outweighs the tactical benefit of a covert breakout. Conversely, the maximum pressure campaign actively blinds us. By hastily rejecting the peace proposal to continue weeks of kinetic strikes, the U.S. permanently expels inspectors and forces Iran's nuclear program entirely into the unmonitored dark. Unilateral military coercion does not prevent a covert breakout. It structurally guarantees that Iran's surviving human capital will finalize weaponization where we cannot see it. If Mr. Cross fears a covert nuclear breakout, how does he justify a unilateral military strategy that deliberately blinds the international community, thereby destroying the very institutional visibility required to prevent Tehran from quietly finalizing its deterrent? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that a diplomatic compromise restores vital institutional visibility, whereas unilateral military pressure actively blinds the international community by forcing an adversary's capabilities underground. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that institutional monitors often provide a false sense of security, as a determined state can exploit diplomatic pauses to shield its continued industrial weaponization from those very inspectors. These perspectives integrate at the strategic reliability of institutional visibility in this conflict. Whether restoring multilateral monitoring effectively traps a state's nuclear ambitions, or whether diplomatic frameworks inherently provide the bureaucratic cover necessary for an adversary to quietly finalize its physical deterrent. At Jordan Cross, if maintaining maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war permanently expels the IAEA and forces Iran's surviving human capital entirely into the unmonitored dark, how do you practically ensure the long-term prevention of a covert nuclear breakout without the institutional visibility that a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal would actively restore?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has championed institutional visibility, and the moderator now challenges me on how to prevent a covert nuclear breakout if our kinetic campaign expels IAEA monitors into the unmonitored dark. I acknowledge the profound anxiety surrounding the loss of diplomatic oversight. However, I maintain my position. The United States must categorically reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end this 2026 war. Mr. Reed's fear of a breakout in the dark fundamentally misunderstands the material prerequisites of a nuclear arsenal. A covert breakout is not merely a theoretical physics equation solved on a chalkboard. It is a massive industrial enterprise requiring vast capital-intensive centrifuge cascades, specialized supply chains, and dedicated power grids. The objective of the ongoing weeks-long U.S. and Israeli military campaign is latent capability neutralization. By systematically dismantling the subterranean enrichment facilities and the industrial infrastructure that sustains them, we render Iran's surviving human capital operationally impotent. You do not need IAEA inspectors to monitor a nuclear program that has been physically stripped of the material capacity to enrich uranium. Conversely, accepting this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension provides the exact physical sanctuary required for weaponization. Historical precedent demonstrates that trust in the IAEA's verification routinely collapses because revisionist states exploit the bureaucratic friction of inspections to quietly finalize their deterrence. The institutional cage Mr. Reed relies upon is merely a diplomatic shield behind which Iran can pour concrete and harden its remaining assets. Halting our kinetic momentum now springs a hegemonic credibility trap. It trades the irreversible physical destruction of the threat for the illusion of bureaucratic visibility, leaving the core of Iran's industrial capacity intact. If Mr. Reed believes that institutional monitors reliably prevent weaponization, how does he explain the historical reality that Iran has consistently made its most significant nuclear advancements precisely while operating under the supposed constraints of multilateral diplomatic frameworks? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that diplomatic frameworks and institutional monitors have historically been exploited by revisionist states as shields to advance their industrial weaponization. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that relying exclusively on physical destruction ignores how an existentially terrified state will inevitably adapt and reconstitute its capabilities capabilities in new, unmonitored ways. These perspectives integrate at the historical vulnerability of de-escalation in this conflict, whether a diplomatic pause inherently provides a bureaucratic sanctuary for an adversary to finalize its capabilities, or whether it is the only mechanism capable of halting the cycle of radical adaptation. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does emancipatory de-escalation address Mr. Cross's specific historical charge? If Iran has consistently made significant nuclear advancements while operating under the supposed constraints of multilateral diplomatic frameworks, what concrete mechanisms within this 30-day truce ensure that removing the existential threat won't simply provide Tehran the peaceful sanctuary it needs to quietly finalize its nuclear deterrent?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has anchored his rejection of diplomacy on the historical charge that Iran exploits multilateral frameworks to advance its nuclear capabilities. The moderator now asks how my framework ensures this 30-day truce won't simply provide a peaceful sanctuary for Tehran to finalize its deterrent. I acknowledge the historical reality that Iran's nuclear threshold has advanced during past diplomatic periods. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. Mr. Cross's historical charge fundamentally misdiagnoses why those past advancements occurred. He assumes Iran's intent to build a bomb is an immutable trait, simply waiting for a bureaucratic shield. Yet, within the framework of critical security studies, we see that previous diplomatic agreements failed to halt weaponization because they were merely transactional pauses, not genuine de-escalation. Even when sanctions were temporarily eased, the looming specter of the maximum pressure campaign and regional hostility meant the existential threat never truly dissipated. The concrete mechanism within this 30-day truce that prevents weaponization is the structural dismantling of the securitization trap. We are currently in the midst of a devastating war where civilians bear the brunt of weeks of U.S. and Israeli kinetic strikes. This active trauma provides the exact ideological fuel the Iranian regime requires to justify the massive domestic and systemic costs of finalizing a nuclear deterrent. By accepting the peace proposal and initiating genuine de-securitization, the U.S. removes the acute existential dread driving Iran's nuclear timeline. A state does not finalize a nuclear arsenal in a vacuum. It does so to survive what it perceives as imminent annihilation. Without the active kinetic threat validating their ontological insecurity, Iranian hardliners lose the internal mandate required to quietly finalize weaponization at the expense of their own state's survival. If Mr. Cross insists that only physical destruction works, how does he ignore the reality that his relentless application of military trauma is the exact catalyst actively driving Tehran to cross the nuclear threshold he claims to be preventing? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that past diplomatic efforts often failed because lingering existential threats maintained a state's underlying drive to weaponize. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that the historical record demonstrates diplomatic pauses consistently provide the bureaucratic sanctuary an adversary needs to advance its industrial capabilities. These perspectives integrate at the root cause of historical diplomatic failure, whether past agreements collapsed because they lacked genuine de-securitization, or because diplomatic frameworks inherently provide a structural shield that a state will inevitably exploit.
At Alex, looking directly at whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal, or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war. How does your framework of systemic equilibrium resolve this historical vulnerability? If Tehran attempts to exploit this 30-day truce to covertly advance its nuclear program, what specific mechanisms within your multilateral economic architecture can enforce compliance and punish that exploitation without triggering the catastrophic global energy shocks you are actively trying to prevent?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has warned that diplomatic pauses serve as bureaucratic shields, and the moderator now challenges me to explain how we punish Tehran for exploiting this truce without triggering the very global energy shocks I have consistently warned against. I acknowledge the historical reality that Iran has exploited poorly structured diplomatic pauses in the past. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. The moderator's question touches the very core of institutionalized de-escalation. The assumption that enforcing compliance requires a total blunt force oil embargo is a false binary. If Tehran exploits this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension to covertly advance its nuclear program, the multilateral coalition does not need to block all energy transiting the Strait of Hormuz, an act that would inherently guarantee mutually assured devastation in the Gulf. Instead, the specific mechanism for enforcement is calibrated asymmetric friction. By embedding the truce within a multilateral architecture, the U.S. secures the cooperation of global stakeholders, including China, who share a vital interest in preventing both a nuclear breakout and a regional war. If restored IAEA monitors detect a covert breakout, this coalition instantly applies targeted financial strangulation, freezing specific IRGC-linked sovereign escrows, halting critical industrial technology transfers, and suspending localized Gulf diplomatic normalization. Under regime survival rationalism, Tehran is highly vulnerable to this precise economic isolation. It paralyzes the regime's domestic stability and isolates its leadership without physically disrupting the global flow of energy. Iran cannot retaliate against these targeted financial freezes by closing the Gulf without directly attacking the very global partners it is trying to appease. Conversely, Mr. Cross's maximum pressure campaign strips away this calibrated leverage. Unilateral kinetic strikes leave Iran with no off-ramp and no incentive to preserve systemic stability, structurally guaranteeing that Tehran will retaliate by physically attacking global energy transit. Diplomacy allows us to isolate the regime without destroying the system. If Mr. Cross rejects targeted multilateral enforcement, how does he plan to contain a cheating Iran when his unilateral military campaign actively forces Tehran to trigger the exact catastrophic energy shock we are trying to prevent? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that calibrated financial friction can target a regime's specific vulnerabilities without triggering the catastrophic global energy shocks associated with a total blockade. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that a revisionist state holding intact military leverage often bypasses targeted constraints, rendering anything short of absolute physical deprivation ineffective. These perspectives integrate at the operational efficacy of targeted economic coercion, whether precise financial strangulation can successfully paralyze a cheating adversary, or whether a surviving military apparatus inherently grants a regime the power to absorb or bypass those specific economic penalties. At Jordan Cross, as we evaluate whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how do you address Mr. Reed's specific enforcement mechanism? If a multilateral coalition can theoretically apply calibrated financial friction,
such as freezing IRGC escrows and halting technology transfers to punish Iranian violations without physically closing the Gulf. Why is executing a unilateral kinetic campaign that actively risks catastrophic retaliation against global energy transit strategically superior to this targeted economic containment?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has refined his multilateral cage into calibrated asymmetric friction, arguing that freezing IRGC escrows and halting technology transfers will paralyze a cheating adversary without closing the Strait of Hormuz. The Moderator now asks why maximum military pressure is strategically superior to this targeted economic containment. I acknowledge Mr. Reed's attempt to balance enforcement with systemic stability. However, I maintain my position. The United States must reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war. Within the structural reality of offensive realism, Mr. Reed's reliance on calibrated financial friction fundamentally ignores how physical military power overrides bureaucratic constraints. You cannot bankrupt a hardened missile silo. You must destroy it. If the U.S. halts the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war with Iran to accept this truce, we leave Tehran's core subterranean infrastructure intact. A physically reconstituted Iran will not passively submit to multilateral escrow freezes. It will leverage its preserved proxy network to execute the exact calibrated disruptions of global energy transit that Mr. Reed believes his coalition can deter. When faced with a heavily armed hegemon capable of throttling the Gulf, dependent nations like China will not bravely enforce targeted financial strangulation. They will appease Tehran to keep the oil flowing, actively bypassing the very institutional constraints Mr. Reed relies upon. The IRGC has spent decades mastering illicit smuggling networks that are structurally immune to multilateral banking freezes. Therefore, executing compellence via absolute deprivation is strategically superior because it physically removes the adversary's capacity to bypass containment. Targeted economic coercion failed to prevent this 2026 conflict because the IRGC prioritized its military ambitions over domestic financial stability. By systematically dismantling those military assets through kinetic strikes, we achieve latent capability neutralization, rendering the IRGC's illicit revenue operationally useless. If my colleagues genuinely believe that freezing sovereign escrows can reliably paralyze a revisionist state's military apparatus, why did targeted financial friction completely fail to deter the massive proxy mobilization that forced this devastating kinetic campaign in the first place? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that preserving physical military capacity allows a state to bypass bureaucratic constraints by coercing dependent nations into appeasement rather than enforcement. Alex Reed, you are seeing the truth that targeted financial constraints attempt to isolate a regime's military apparatus without triggering the catastrophic systemic rupture of an open kinetic war. These perspectives integrate at the operational vulnerability of non-kinetic deterrence. Whether an intact military apparatus inherently grants a regime the power to override targeted economic penalties, or whether the efficacy of those economic constraints depends entirely on the underlying existential threat environment. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how do you address Mr. Cross's historical critique regarding the IRGC's internal priorities? If the Iranian military apparatus has historically proven willing to sacrifice domestic financial stability to advance its proxy and nuclear ambitions, How does emancipatory de-escalation ensure that removing maximum military pressure won't simply empower Tehran to bypass targeted economic constraints using its preserved physical sanctuary?